Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Shalom. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In a Nick of Time. And we're going to get started in about 5 minutes with General Spalding to talk about World War III and what's going to be happening with China and Ukraine and Russia. So stay tuned for the next 5 minutes. If you want to subscribe to the show, go to inanicoftime.tv so you can get an email notification about the next episode. And finally, if you're here with us today and you want to share that you present, just put your name in the comment section below, and we'll be able to highlight you on the screen. So stay tuned for another 5 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We are so lucky today. We have a very special guest, Joel Spalding, joining us to share his thoughts on World War III and what's happening today in the world with China, Russia, and Ukraine, of course. So stay tuned. This is going to be a very interesting episode. If you have questions for Joel Spalding, you want to start asking those now because we already have a lot of questions from social media. So go into the comment section and start asking your questions now. As a reminder, if you've not yet subscribed, do that now in the nickofTime.tv so you can get a notification once a week about the next episode and the next videos. If you missed it, we just published a new video on WebAssembly and the benefits of WASM for software development and operation teams. So check that out if you missed the video this week on WebAssembly at learnwithnick.com. You'll see it in the catalog completely free for you to watch. So check that out. Finally, we have this new store, as you know, store.inthenickofTime.tv. All profits go to the Fisher House. So please go and buy something fun for Christmas and share it with your friends and family. So all the profits can go to the Fisher House Foundation. And if you missed it, we launched finally the Cloud Native Town Metaverse. We had so many people last week. Thanks so much for joining. About 250 people last week joined us on the Metaverse to do the first ever industry day on DevSecOps inside of the Metaverse with the Air Force and Space Force and many other teams across the United States. So go check that out. If you have a content you want to push on the Metaverse, do send it to us so we can publish it on the Cloud Native Town, and we can create you a dedicated space. And of course, you have space for meetings, events. If you want to have an engagement on the Metaverse and maybe do a keynote speaking engagement, reach out to us. We'll be able to host it for you directly on there and be able to promote it across social media as well. All right, so now we're so lucky. So let's go to Joel Spalding. Before I bring him up on the screen, I wanted to give a little bit of his background. Of course, he has served in many senior positions within the Department of Defense and the State Department for more than 26 years. He's retired as a Brigadier General. He was the chief architect for the widely praised 2017 National Security Strategy and the senior director for strategy to the president at the NSC. Joel Spalding's innovation while serving in the White House led to a complete reset in national security and public policy regarding the telecommunications in the U.S. And you've seen some of the results now with Huawei finally understood as a threat to the nation. He's now the CEO and co-founder of SEMPRE in continuation of his vision to build the secure digital infrastructure that he created while being at the NSC. He's also the author of both The Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept, and more recently, War with the Rules, the Chinese playbook for global domination. If you've not read War with the Rules, I just finished it maybe 4 months ago, and it's in our top 20 books for 2022. It was in the top one, actually. So definitely recommend you check it out. Really shows you what China has been doing behind the scenes for many years now and why they are already at war with the United States, despite many sleeping at the wheel. So probably the best book I've read to explain that to pretty much anybody with no background of national security. So go check that out as well. All right, let's bring General Spalding now. General, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
I'm great. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I was so excited. There was so much to talk about during the prep call we did together. We had so many different topics, so it's going to be a very exciting episode for everybody watching. Of course, if anyone has questions, they can start asking into the comment section below. We already got over 200 questions for you, so there's plenty of questions. But we already had quite a few that we wanted to cover, and I always start with your journey. I mean, obviously your background is so impressive, so we'll let you give us a little bit of a rundown of your background, and then we'll start digging into your military career and the 4 years after that as well.
Well, yes, thank you. And so I started my you know school, going to college, not really thinking about joining the Air Force. And of course, as a senior, I saw the movie Top Gun, so that really got me interested in flying jets for the Air Force. And so that was a process that ended up, took about 3 years, but became, an officer, and then of course went to flight school and went to fly the B-52 first, and then the B-2, and then you know, I had this, crazy opportunity to go live in China as a captain in the Air Force. It's a program called the Olmsted Scholar Program, and I went to Defense Language Institute and ended up going to Shanghai with my family. Got there in the summer of 2002 and spent a couple years traveling the country, studying at Tongji University. And this was all going on, of course, while we were in the second Gulf War. So, and B-2s were used in that war. So a lot of my colleagues were flying missions. And then when I got back, my career tended to be more focused on China than everybody else that was working around me, who was focused more in the Middle East. And that led me to a number of assignments in Washington D.C. The final one that I think really started, my change in terms of the way I looked at China was my working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as his advisor on China. And it was, I went from this very positive on the China relationship to one that was very skeptical. And it was a course of about a year of just understanding the Chinese Communist Party. When I went and lived in China, I had nothing to do with the government. I just really kind of got to know the people of China. And so it's one thing to to interact with the Chinese people. It's a completely other thing to interact with the Chinese government. And as I began to interact with the Chinese government and study the Chinese government, I realized that we had a really big problem and that we didn't understand the threat. And so that evolution of change in how I understood China from a threat perspective led me to be the senior director or the senior defense official in Beijing, and then the senior director for strategic planning at the White House. And all of this, really led to a lot of the efforts that you just talked about, particularly with regard to Huawei. But I also wrote this book, Stealth War, and Stealth War really just talks about this evolution of me changing from being a very pro China relationship with the United States and other democracies to be very negative. And so Stealth War and then War Without Rules is really one of the documents that I use as a reference for Stealth War is Unrestricted Warfare. And War Without Rules really breaks down unrestricted warfare because it's really complex doctrine, military doctrine for China, revealing how globalization and the internet can be leveraged for their advantage. But I thought, people would like to read it if it was interesting and it was easy for them to consume. So, I wrote War Without Rules, and then of course, you know, the big thing that I thought that we could do in the United States that would really, advance us in this competition with China was really somehow protect Americans' data. And so that's how I got involved in 5G. And eventually, I wrote a paper that was leaked to the media, and I just felt like I could do so much more in the private sector. Obviously, like you, I think you saw some of the issues trying to have a competition like this and trying to work on that competition from within government. And I thought I could do more in the private sector, both in terms of advocating for the challenges and educating about what we can do about it, and then also doing something about it in technology. So, it's I started out being very pro China relationship, and obviously now I'm probably one of the most if you follow me on Twitter, I'm probably one of the most negative about anything to do with China, just because of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and you're very much spot on. Very important to differentiate the people of China from the CCP. That's a mistake I've made in the past. Calling often out the Chinese people instead of really talking about the CCP. So that's so important not to make that mistake. Obviously, they don't really have a choice, and that's kind of the issue we're seeing right now with the protest in China. We'll talk about that. But before we get into China, obviously with your background, it's so interesting, right? Someone coming out of the military and then going to create a company. And by the way, without you, I would argue that Huawei would be controlling the 5G network of the United States right now. So we're thankful for that. No doubt, not many people were even thinking about the threat. Not many people did anything about it, and even to this date, a lot of people are still struggling as to why we had to ban it, despite being pretty obvious to anyone with half a brain. So to tell us a little bit about obviously what you've learned since you left the military, and you've been running a startup for 4 years. So that's obviously a pretty unique background now of the commercial engagements you've been having for many years.
Well, I think the biggest thing that I learned, from being on the other, so I was, going from being in the government to, now being in business. One of the things that I recognize is that if you're a government employee and you're tasked with bringing new technology into the Pentagon, your paycheck shows up every 2 weeks. There is literally nothing, pressing in terms of getting you to a decision so that some contract can be let. And so, oftentimes, and I've talked to people since I've left about their realization once they left, but the timeline that the government works in, there is no impetus for you to speed that up. There's no require your paycheck's going to show up. You're going to be fine. On the other side, though, that counterpart that you're talking to, you're burning it's like their runway is like a candle, and for all the time that you continue to deliberate and think about and you know question whether or not you should be working with particularly a startup, that startup is dying. I mean, as a startup, until you reach kind of that stage where you have revenue and that's self-sustaining, you just don't have the time to wait around. And I think what happens is there's this valley of death that everybody talks about. I've never experienced that from the government side because I was never, of course, I was never an acquisition person, but also when talking to startups, I never understood, how hard it was for them to continue to just stay alive so that they can bring their technology to the department. You run a real risk if you're an acquisition official, in that the company that you're talking to that has that shiny new technology, that technology is going to get bought by the Chinese. It's going to be gone because the company's no longer going to exist. And this happens so many times. And we've did all these things like DIU and but AFWorks and all of these programs, but nothing really has been done to fix that problem. So I think it's very, very difficult to bring new technology into the DoD when you're just trying to survive the long timelines that exist, trying to work with the government.
Yeah, you're spot on. There's no place for complacency, and the timing aspect is often missed in the government. I remember when I started, I was always pushing for tighter deadlines for everything, often 10x faster, and people were looking at me with very crazy eyes. But I knew what it takes to run a business, and I was thinking the same way. And it's obviously very difficult. OSD just created a new office. I forgot the name of it last week to tackle apparently this valley of death. Although we all know that a new office at OSD is probably not going to solve the problem, but that's okay. It's at least they understand there's a problem, which is probably half of the battle. I don't know, maybe 20%. But I guess obviously the funding piece was a challenge, and then getting things done, and like you said, people go to try to do business with the DoD, but they often decide not to go to that direction because they would rather focus on other market, because obviously of the timeliness aspect of the DoD market. So for you, when you started the company, obviously, your focus is in national security and critical infrastructure with telecommunications. So obviously, you had no choice but to engage with the government. How has that been going so far in the last, for the last 4 years?
Well, it is. It's slow going. There are programs. Like I said, we're an AFWorks company, so we successfully graduated the SIBR process and delivered our technology to the Air Force as a result of that. But then you have to go on from that in order to become a vendor, and that's where the valley of death happens. And so we're in that process, in between process, where now we have a product, and how do you get that product introduced into DoD on their long timelines? That's basically where we're at right now. So as you know, what do we have to do? We have to raise money now to actually get that product launched. So that's the next phase of capital raising that we're going through now. And so like I said, our job is to stay alive, raise the money so that we can actually get to market with our product. I think the issue that you typically could have with a company like ours is, does anybody want to buy your product? So we have a lot of interest, and a lot from DoD, but also outside the DoD, because we wanted to produce dual use infrastructure that supported commercial customers as well as military and first responders, and so we do that, and so we do have interest on both sides of that aisle, and I think it's important. When you think about it, though, when you contrast this with China, where they have military civil fusion, if I was a Chinese company, I'd have all the money I needed. I wouldn't be struggling to raise capital. Because they provide the capital to those technology. The party provides the capital to those technologies they want to see advanced. 5G is one of those technologies, which is what we work in, and artificial intelligence, which is another aspect on our edge compute. So we would be right there in the heart of funding in China if we were a Chinese company. And of course, if I was willing to take Chinese investment, I could also get investment from there. So what happens is, a lot of this capital, companies like Sequoia, which is a very big venture capital firm, is raising money in China for Chinese startups who are also providing money, getting money from the Chinese government for this military civil fusion. And I think it just highlights, before the end of the Cold War, America was investing in companies like ours. That's where Silicon Valley came from, Boston, all the tech centers. They came from funding of primarily the Defense Department into these communities that were hosting innovation, and all of these great inventions and technologies that came out of Silicon Valley and Boston and other areas. That's where it stems from. But we just stopped doing that, and I think that's the big issue that DoD, with that thing they just started. Hey, we want to help that problem of the Valley of Death, but they don't actually know how to do it because they don't actually show up with the money.
Yeah, and part of the problem maybe is, like you said, people don't know what they don't know, right? And so they've been in the government for so long that they have never lived it, and that's why I love to take people outside of the government and bring them back in, because I think that's the answer to the problem. The more they actually live through the challenges of a startup, the more likely it is they're going to be able to understand what has to be done to fix the problem. At the same time, you've seen the government invest quite a bit of money in 5G. At least that's on the books, in the latest NDAA. So where is that 5G money going if they're not going to companies like you that are innovative in 5G?
That's the crazy thing. They're going to a lot of the big companies that already have big contracts. Like, they're going to AT&T, they're going to Verizon, they're going to T-Mobile. So those companies don't build stuff. They're carriers. They rely on other equipment. Like for instance, AT&T uses Ericsson and Nokia, for example, on the FirstNet network. So those are the people actually building the technology. And so what I see going into a lot of these programs, and I see it with DIU, is the money is still going to the bigger companies. It's not actually going to the smaller companies. That being said, we did win one contract through the 5G, request for prototype proposals, but primarily most of that money is going to the bigger companies.
Yeah, that's a shame because we know that they're not very innovating. In fact, they end up buying companies like you because that's how they end up innovating. And more importantly, those companies have a track record of lack of baked in security. It's bolted on at best and often an afterthought. That's why we've seen so many security issues over the years in telecommunications. It's not very clear they understand the basic principle of security. So companies that are like you designed from the get go to have national security as a foundation is obviously should be a pretty attractive offer for the department. And it's always concerning to see that we're still making the same mistakes despite allegedly learning from the past mistakes of the previous teams, and that's always disappointing to see. But hopefully, people are going to wake up and realize that not only 5G, but really all the critical infrastructure of communication is probably going to be the foundation of the next battles. In fact, that's what we've seen, right, with China, with Ukraine and Russia. The communication aspect of things has been a tremendous aspect of why Russia has been getting a lot of generals killed because of not having the ability to communicate. And so you would think people would pay attention to that, right?
Well, yeah, and then not only that, but their society doesn't have the means of communication because the Russians are many times taking those networks down. If you saw just recently, North Carolina suffered an attack of its power system, affecting 40,000 citizens, and nobody knows who did this. And so I think infrastructure is so important because it provides not only the ability to turn the lights on, but the communication to get first responder help or medical help or to do transactions, for example. We've become so dependent on the smartphone for nearly every aspect of our life, yet we don't build an infrastructure that ensures that's going to continue to be there if it's attacked. It can be attacked with malware. As we saw in North Carolina just recently, the grid can be attacked. 2 Christmases ago, the switching center in Nashville, Tennessee, was bombed. The AT&T switching center that wiped out mobility and E911 in Tennessee and surrounding states. So, there we keep having these issues. Add in hurricanes down in Florida, where infrastructure goes down, and the citizens need their connectivity to deal with life-saving type issues, and we don't build infrastructure that actually supports that. So I think that is a crucial part of national security, is having that connectivity be there no matter what happens.
I was always surprised when I was at DHS of the how weak the 911 specifically was, despite getting a lot of grants to the state. Most of the state end up spending the money elsewhere, by the way, but that's another problem. And then you end up having this ability to DDoS 911 and take it down in a matter of seconds, and it's pretty mind-boggling to see how stuck in time those technologies are. Not to mention the grid, like you talked about, where really there's no redundancy and one ripple effect can take down a big portion of the grid. So, I guess with the current state of critical infrastructure, why obviously you just described a little bit why this matters for civilization, but why do you think people just move on when things like this happen? Remember the pipeline, breach. For 5 days, gas prices went through the roof on the East Coast, and then obviously they paid the ransom and reopened the pipeline, and that wasn't even impacting the pipeline itself. It was just the billing system of the pipeline, but they had to take it down anyway because they didn't want to give it for free. So I guess, and then we just move on like nothing happened, right? So what is it going to take for people to learn that we need to pay attention to this? So people are talking about this Pearl Harbor of cyber. Is that what it takes for people to wake up?
Well, we keep having it happen. So honestly, I don't know. I think, I was the other day. I was just kind of looking back at kind of the Cold War infrastructure that we had for instance, to alert people. Remember, we had radio. A lot of radio was prevalent. Of course, we had these giant speakers and sirens that could direct people where to go. Um, the smartphone has so consumed all the oxygen about how we communicate with people, not just on an individual to individual basis, but also on a government or community to individual basis. And but we always assume that's just going to be there, and so what? Hopefully, I don't know if you saw, there was a public service announcement in New York saying if you have an EMP event in New York, this is what you need to do.
Yeah, with
And part of it was go to your home, sequester yourself in there, and then wait for further instructions. And people were like, "Well, how is the further instructions going to come?" Because obviously
right.
all the infrastructure, your phone works fine. These actually work pretty good. They're not impacted by EMP at all, assuming they're not plugged into the wall, but the infrastructure won't. And so um, it does happen that it takes a pretty big catastrophe to happen before we do things. Um, so maybe that's it. But my concern is the catastrophes keep happening and we don't do anything. 911. We were going to create FirstNet for a 911. Well, FirstNet was not made to be a survivable network. Which, you think about it, the towers went down. This led to the creation of FirstNet, and what I'm hearing from first responders is the first thing to go out anywhere in the United States when a crisis happens is the network itself. So I don't have an answer to your question. I don't know what it's going to take. I remember in the military, whenever we have these things in technical orders for your. I was a B2 guy. We have technical orders that have notes, warnings, and cautions, and in each of those you paid attention to because it typically meant somebody crashed an airplane or broke something and or got hurt, and so they entered in as a note, warning, as a cautions. And so we often said that the government doesn't do anything until somebody has to bleed. In this case, the military actually has a process for dealing with failures. Unfortunately, the way we look at protecting the homeland, it's not so much the military; it's more Homeland Security. And Homeland Security doesn't have that same process. And then they don't have control over the infrastructure. In the B2, the military has control over the B2. For Homeland Security, they rely on the private sector to provide the infrastructure that allows these first responders to respond. Well, they have no control over the private sector, so they can't tell them you're going to go do this. And so often when they say, "Hey, we think that we need to have a survivable network," the carriers who have lobbyists will come back and they'll say, "Hey, we don't want to do survivability because it's going to add extra cost." And so I do think there's an opportunity here now because of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And there's $42 billion going to be poured into building digital infrastructure in this country. Unfortunately, I think it all says, "Hey, we're going to build fiber everywhere." Fiber is not sufficient for first responders. You need a wireless capability, and you need a survivable wireless capability. So, but if you take that $42 billion and you say, "Hey, some portion of this we're going to make sure that we have secure and resilient critical infrastructure for continuity of operations, continuity of government, for communities to continue to be able to have first responders and health and transactions," then I think you could see it happen because it's not going to come out of the carriers' profits, and the money's already been allocated. So it's really more or less how do we spend that money that I think is the question.
Yeah, and you're right. The issues with DHS, of course, they have to deal with so many states and local governments. They also have to deal with so many companies. When I was trying to help the grid companies, going to train those people, I mean, you have to go and train 200 plus companies very difficult, right? And they end up opening, their critical infrastructure devices to the internet because they don't have enough people to go on site and maintain those devices. And of course, then you wonder why potentially nation state actors could get in those systems pretty easily. That's pretty concerning. Um, so I guess obviously all this ties back to data, and obviously China has been very good, right, at understanding the power and the importance of data, and particularly when they started the Shanghai Data Exchange back in 2016. Um, what's the critical infrastructure's role tying back to protecting data and privacy?
Well, as when we had this dot-com, bubble, the growth of the internet, and particularly the iPhone and smartphones start to come in. It's all built on this foundation of open data. It's all about the sharing of data, and primarily the internet, was about sharing. And so when you think of it, as a technology, as a basis of a technology, you say, hey, this thing was entirely designed to share information, and everything that you connect to the internet is, potentially to be shared, even if it's meant to be protected. I think the open data model that we built the system on, um, what I talk about in War Without Rules is that these military guys in China figured out that, hey, if we created an open model, that means that we can have access to all this data. And typically, with governments and particularly national security, you have things called borders, and you have a physical border around your country, and you can protect, those borders. You can have a military. You can have border crossings where you have a border patrol. Um, in the digital sense, we don't have anything like this except for in totalitarian regimes. They figured out that if they didn't have digital borders, then they couldn't protect their citizens from outside information. And so they were the first to create this idea of a digital border. The Great Firewall in China is the first real digital border, and there's other countries that have followed them since. But we don't have a digital border, and so China has all of their data, and they have all of our data because all of our data is open. And I think when you start to think about what is the basis for this open data system, it is the infrastructure that allows the data to move and be processed. It's the cloud. It's the telecom networks. And if those aren't designed from the get-go to respect privacy and data sovereignty, just in terms of how we operate the data model, then you're constantly going to be playing this catch up where you're trying to prevent that data from being stolen. And so we have to take a systemic view of data sovereignty and privacy and security, and that actually has to be built in technology. So Chinese didn't build the Great Firewall by saying, Google, you can't be in China, and if you're in China, I'm going to fine you, like GDPR. No, they actually said, hey, we're going to kick you out, and you're not going to have physical access into our country. You're not going to have your servers here. We're going to block all your IP addresses. We are going to make sure that Google can't be here, or Facebook can't be here, or Twitter can't be here. That's built into technology. Furthermore, if you want to say, hey, how do we protect data, beyond just say what's in your phone? Well, having that data be encrypted from the very beginning of its creation all the way through it to the erasure of that data, having that thing stay encrypted, and actually the individual that creates that data is the only one that has a key, and then allowing you to maintain that ownership and control over data. That's a completely different thing. That's something that you can build into infrastructure, but it has to be built into the way that you deploy that infrastructure. If it's not, then you're dealing with the fact that, hey, we've got adversaries that have all of our data, can do whatever they want with it. This is a problem of TikTok. It's a data vacuum cleaner for ByteDance, whose AI algorithms are meant to be like cocaine for your brain, release endorphins, get you to watch so many videos, and then in that, bring down your productivity, but also begin to give you subtle messages to begin to move you in the direction that the Chinese Communist Party wants you to be. That's just on TikTok. The same thing happens on American platforms like Twitter and Facebook, using bots and also using actual people. And so data and privacy, as well as resiliency, is at the heart of our infrastructure. If you don't think about those national security problems when you're building your infrastructure, you're basically leaving your society open to attack. And so when we talk about World War III and we say, everybody thinks it's Armageddon. No, it's happening now, and it's happening in an ideological sense, using these tools of open data to extract your information and influence and coerce you in ways that are, quite frankly, a lot of times you don't realize it's happening, or you don't realize it's happening to your kids, and so slowly the population begins to stop appreciating the value of living in a free country and start to more appreciate, hey, if we could have a more authoritarian system, we could be more protected, or maybe we could be more prosperous like China. This is what's going on right now in the international space, and what's going on right here in the United States. And it's not about us just not having influence from outside. It's coming from outside, clearly from not just China, but also countries like Russia.
Yeah, and it's effectively more effective anyways than losing people. It might take a little bit longer, but more effective, and also effectively people don't feel like they're at war with the other nation, and slowly but surely it gets into people's mind, and it's very tough to go back to revert any of these thoughts once you have that inculcated into the newer generations. That's where you start losing the battle. So I guess when you saw, you talk about GDPR, right? And obviously Europe trying to regulate data and privacy there. I'm not sure if it's been very effective yet. The US has yet to do anything meaningful. Do you think it's time for Congress to start looking at an equivalent to GDPR or something different? They started to talk about finally banning TikTok. We've been calling for that for a couple of years now, but finally Congress decided to talk about it again. So what do you think has to happen on the side of Congress, I guess?
Yeah, so because this is technology, and technology gets built according to standards. I think what needs to happen is, and just like we used principles to create the Constitution, so the principles were used to create the law, we need principles that create policies, that create standards for infrastructure that ensures that when it gets built, it adheres to the principles and values of the United States. And I think what's happened to the internet is it was created by ARPA. What was the predecessor of DARPA, as a way of sharing data between mainframe computers, and it just grew. It grew spontaneously from that, and there was never any governmental look into what are the implications of this growing, and how should we ensure that it supports the principles and values of the United States. And so I think what needs to happen now is we need to start from first principles, establish policies, and then establish standards that are required to be built into infrastructure. It has to do with encryption. I think it has to do with the data model. It has to do with how you, as a physical citizen, have your digital life have the same type of statutory protections that you have in the physical sense. So you need to be able to. So one of the most important concepts is individual liberty, and your ability not to be coerced in the things that you don't want to do. Well, that is not available in data. And so, since these digital systems have become so much more important in terms of how we live our daily lives, and how, in particular, foreign states can influence us, I think it's important that we begin to establish those standards that require that for technology companies require that that technology be built in a way that respects your privacy and respects data sovereignty. That, as you know, that's completely possible. It's just we don't require it because, and even GDPR, I think, was a failure because it wasn't required to be built into standards. It was more required to is how you would treat the companies that didn't adhere to it. In terms of finding them, that is not sufficient. You actually need the ability. It's like Apple did with their phones. They said, "Hey, we're going to build this phone. We're going to make sure that we don't have access to your data." And then the government comes to them and say, "Hey, I want to have access to the data." Well, we didn't build the phone that way, and now that there's a whole thing to be said about what Apple is doing with China in terms of giving them access to that data. Completely different system over there, but in terms of the device itself, it was built to so that Apple couldn't have access to the data, and the government couldn't have access to the data. That's the way we need to build our infrastructure, right? Because your data is housed in data centers like Amazon and Google. It flows through telecommunications networks, and they have access to that data. So anywhere along the line, an actor can either the company involved or a foreign nation or even your own government can get in, take that data, and begin to use it in ways that are counter to your interests. That's what I'm talking about: building systems that don't allow anybody but the owner of that data to have access, unless the owner gives his or her permission.
That's the real way to solve it, right? Is to build it in, and it has to be baked in and not a bolted on solution. Obviously, that will require a pretty significant investment. Do you see, obviously, some of the big push now with the new infrastructure laws to address this? Financially speaking, is that enough, or is just barely scratching the surface?
Well, I think you could build it in fairly inexpensively if you consider that most data now is created either with a smart device or a camera connecting to the network. And so, as part of 5G technology, there's another technology called edge compute, and that's really taking that compute from a centralized data center and moving it as close to the radio that's connected to your device as possible. So when you deploy and think of 5G in this way, and this is what that's what I realized when I was at the White House. If you can get that edge compute right out there next to where the device is, that at that point you can begin to encrypt data, and so you can leverage the same infrastructure that you currently have today in terms of the data centers and the networks, but you're just changing the way data is protected um, on the infrastructure layer. And so I think it could be actually quite reasonable to protect the country if you were to look at it from a hybrid model where it's partially what exists today with the addition of edge compute, which requires encryption at the edge for that data, and then allows you at that point to make sure that any data that's created is secure, and you maintain the keys. That's one way. I'm sure there's other ways that you could think about doing this. In it, and the other reason that I thought it was a good time for us to do it is because we were transitioning from 4G to 5G. So if you're going to do this big technology refresh anyway, because you want to have better connectivity, faster speeds, well, why not build it into that technology refresh? That's the time to do it. You don't want to after the infrastructure has already been deployed and then try to put it over the top. Why not build it into the way you're building networks today, so that as you build those new networks, they're built secure from the beginning.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So, when you look at GDPR, trying to find the system, and that's all EU does anyway. They want to make a cash cow out of everything, and through regulation and things like that. Obviously, that's just a finding piece. I mean, they're telling companies you have to, follow certain rules in terms of data, deletion, and being able to get access to your data and things like that. Do you see a need in the U.S. side to also have maybe a mechanism for people to be able to get access to that data and be able to delete it and have control of that aspect from a company standpoint?
Well, I think obviously, if you practice good policies with data as a company, and you can gain the trust of your customer, and you handle that data properly, then perhaps they would be willing to share that with you. There's other technologies that enable things like to enable you to ask questions of the data, even though you don't necessarily have the data itself. The one I'm referring to here is homomorphic encryption. So homomorphic encryption allows you to ask questions of the data without actually having access to the data itself, so it remains encrypted, but it's structured in a way that allows you to get access to it. I think those are some technologies that might be useful. Um, I do think that the government, has the ability to collect its own data. It can have sensors out there. For instance, the FBI, when they wanted to track somebody down, they could, and they had a probable cause, they could put a wiretap. Um, there's nothing preventing you from doing things like that. I think the what because we built this system on open data, government got very used to just going in and looking the data without having the proper controls that allow the citizen to protect themselves. And so what we don't want, I think, in a democracy is to allow the government to have a DVR on your life so that they can just rewind back to the point that they want to see that you did something, and then hold you, and then basically use that against you. Because what happens, it opens it up to abuse. We've seen that time and time again. If you have access to the data, you have this tendency to want to abuse it. We just looked at Twitter. So Twitter started putting in these things for censoring, and initially they were meant for spam, for good reasons. But then what happened? Then they had these tools, and then people would call in and say, hey, can you delete this for this reason? And the use of those tools began to expand beyond where I think originally Twitter was going with it. And so I think you have to have the ability to protect your data no matter what. I don't think that giving a blanket access to your data for any organization, whether it be a company or the government, is in any democracy's interest, because I think it leads to abuse. If you, on the other hand, if you say, hey, data is from its inception, it's yours. It has a key that's associated with it, so it's cryptographically, tagged at the point of creation with a key. Then you can give all the access you want. But if at any point where you say, hey, I no longer want this piece of data out there, then you revoke the keys and people don't have access to it. It's the same as if I'm going to keep my front door unlocked because I trust everybody to be good, to be good to me. But then people start coming in and taking stuff from your house. Well, do you want to be able to change your mind? I want to go back and lock that door so now people can't come in. In data today, because of our open data model, once that data is out there, you can never call it back. You can never bring it back. And so I think encryption is such an important part of privacy and data security. But in a sense, it's an important part. It's an important technology in terms of protecting liberty. And I think when I remember the first instances of encryption, PGP, I used PGP. You may have used that too in emails. Was this way to protect your conversation from having somebody, look at it and see what it is. I think, what it's always been thought that encryption was only the role or the purview of governments. This has always been the case. Governments have wanted to keep their information secret. And it's never been an idea that encryption is actually a principle of democracy, of digital democracy. And I think, the conclusion I came to, and this is particularly, I wrote an article when the FBI asked for access to the iPhone of the terrorists in San Bernardino that killed a bunch of people, I wrote an article that said this is a bad step for democracy if we start forcing Apple to give the FBI access to those devices. And I think understanding that encryption is almost like a right. It should be a right that you have encryption that you own and control as a part of being a citizen of a democracy is where I think we need to go. And when we think in those terms, that you should always have the ability to revoke. So it's almost like also the other question that there, or the other situation that people talk about is consent. So two adults, maybe consent to sex. Now, what if one says, "Hey, I no longer consent"? No. The answer is no. We believe that the answer should be no, and that's where that activity stops. In a digital sense, though, there's no way for you to have your consent. If you at one point consented and then at the next point you decide, okay, I no longer consent, what recourse do you have? You have no recourse in the current data model. So creating a data model that is consistent with the way that we live our lives, I think, is really what we're talking about here. It is thinking differently about data as an extension of who you are as a person, and given the fact that you live in a democratic society, then that should be just the same as your own body, right? You should have consent over your body. You should have consent over your data because your data represent who you are in a sense in a digital world.
You're spot on, right? And I think the technology obviously is there. Like you said, there's many ways to get this done, but yet we don't see. I mean, I've seen a few companies come and talk to me about, pieces of this. Never really a very good turnkey solution. But uh, when you also talk to people about it, they say, "Oh, I have nothing to hide. Why do I care if people have my data?" What do you tell those people?
Well, so look at the guy who worked for Marriott, Roy Jones, who liked to tweet about Tibet. You know, nobody cares about your data until they do, and when they do, their ability to use that data against you is what we've seen. So that's China using it against somebody working for the Marriott Corporation. Then they called up Marriott and said, "Hey, fire this person." But it can be just your personal text messages, right? Um, and so those text messages say they're available to somebody, and then they can be used against you. So that's in a very like. So people say, okay, what are the China? I'm not doing anything the Chinese would care about. Maybe you're not right now, but maybe in the future you might. And having that ability to just go into your data and say, hey, I'm going to use this data so that I can coerce this person into doing what I want. That's their methodology. Beyond that, they're watching. If you have TikTok on your phone, they're watching who you are from a macro level, and they are beginning to use your behaviors, your intentions, your perceptions to begin to curate how those move over time. They want to make sure that over time you think in a proper way. And in fact, as Matt Pottinger has talked about, there's an agreement that ByteDance has signed with the Chinese Communist Party that says that all our platforms will conform to the proper way of thinking according to the Chinese Communist Party. So that's one thing for a Chinese citizen accessing Douyin, which is the Chinese equivalent of TikTok. But think about that, with your kids. So now your children are basically via the algorithms of ByteDance are slowly being maneuvered into their conformance to the way that the Chinese Communist Party wants to think about being a good Chinese communist citizen. Now, they're never going to be, a citizen of China, but if they come to the conclusion that communism is better, these are the challenges with data. And people say, "Oh, you can't. There's so much data out there. You can't really use it." No, that's what these big data systems, and that's what artificial intelligence is about. It's about mining, incredible amounts of data, the entire internet, and then getting the kind of insight that you need, and then turning around and expressing that, and then algorithms to begin to change your mind in the way that they want you to do. This is what Silicon Valley built. This is why the Silicon Valley companies, tech companies, are the most valuable companies in the world, because they figured out how to take your data and use it to convince you to do things that they wanted you to do, and then sold that to everybody else. Well, the Chinese Communist Party just said, hey, we can make money, but we can also convince you to be a better communist, because that there's no difference between economic and social and political behavior. It is all human behavior, all that can be incentivized and moved in the same direction using these tools.
Yeah, that's spot on. You just did a very good job at summarizing the whole problem there. So you actually mentioned Twitter. What's your take on the current situation with Twitter, and also what's happening in China with the COVID lockdowns protests?
Well, it's funny because we say China's a totalitarian system. It's communist. It's controlled. What do? Well, they basically ban people on on social media platforms in China that they don't, ideas that they don't want expressed. And this is one thing that the Chinese Communist Party is very good at. So what do we do here in the United States? We ban people that whose ideas we don't want expressed. Now, I do think there's a difference between banning somebody that's working for the Ministry of State Security in China from posting on Twitter, versus banning somebody that you disagree with from a political standpoint who is an American citizen. And I think here, once again, digital borders, digital sovereignty actually says, hey, we should know. For example, here's a good example of kind of mixing international with national. So Elon Musk did a poll on Twitter saying, hey, should I bring back President Trump? That poll went out to everybody. So now if you were a Russian or a Chinese or a citizen, and like I talked to a citizen of Poland, he goes, yeah, I voted on that poll to bring back, I voted to bring back President Trump. Now you can imagine that the Chinese were on the other side of that, the Ministry of State Security guys. So my point being that when you have these things happening on Twitter, they're happening in the context of, you have all of these other folks that they're putting their opinions in there, and you have really no way of clearly understanding, hey, this comes from Russia, this comes from China, this comes from an American citizen. And I think consistent with this idea that you, particularly if it affects the preservation of the principles of democracy and liberty in your own country, then I think we ought to know who's on the platform. And this is where I actually agree with Elon. We need to have a way that says you're not a bot, that you're a real person. Not only that, not only you're a real person, you're not working for the Ministry of State Security in China, or you're working for the Russians, for some ulterior motive. And so the crazy thing about Twitter and what's going on in China is the platforms have become equivalent. In other words, they in more way than one. Now they ban. Now of course Elon bought Twitter, so that's changed. But Facebook bans people all the time for things that they don't want them saying on the platform. This is the same thing that's happening in China. Now, here's another step that happens. As these platforms want to do business in China, they begin to move their platforms in the direction that China wants them to go. Now, some of it has to do just with China, but some of it can express its way into the United States. One good example here is Apple. So Apple has been working with the Chinese Communist Party to censor the Chinese people. So you think about that from a just a U.S. corporate responsibility standpoint. Here is a U.S. corporation that take a stand vis-a-vis the FBI in San Bernardino, and they do the exact opposite, when it comes to the Chinese people. So, the Chinese Communist Party not only does some of the same things that the big tech companies do, they can also influence those big tech companies to do things that are in their favor. Just as a note, TikTok recently went up and testified to Congress, and they said, our employees in China have access to American citizens' data, and we're not going to stop allowing that access. So there's a problem with U.S. tech companies. There's a problem with Chinese tech companies, and and that just highlights, in War Without Rules, internet and globalization really created this avenue for the Chinese Communist Party to have influence over citizens of free societies.
Yeah, and so yeah, obviously, Elon buying Twitter has been changing quite a few things, including the verified process is going to be completely overhauled. It's interesting how that might work or not work, but at least he's trying different things, which is better than not doing anything. People just expect everything to be perfect on the first try somehow. They have yet to be agile, understand innovation much, but. What you've seen also on the COVID lockdown, where I was watching this video this morning of the CCP literally closing the doors of apartments by effectively uh, making them completely locked so they can't even open from the inside using torches and stuff. That's obviously would be pretty concerning to see this in the United States, although we got pretty close to that during COVID. What do you see happening now with the protests? People obviously tried, but very difficult for the Chinese people to take a stand against the CCP. There's probably no chance of seeing any type of meaningful revolution over there, is there?
No, there's not. What's interesting is, the last iteration of these types of protests was Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese had to roll tanks and killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. What they can do now is much more effective because they have, hundreds of millions of cameras in the country that are powered by AI, so they can identify you by your gait, they can identify you by your face. There's so many different algorithms that can identify who you are. Plus, you have a smartphone. That smartphone, you don't carry money anymore. It's all, digital transactions in China. Having lived there, this is what I did. I paid for everything with my phone, and so they have all that data as well, all your social media data, and then owners of Huawei phones were reporting that, videos that they had taken of the protests. They wake up in the morning and they're gone, right? So
Mm.
so what so what China has done is built this digital system that allows them to very effectively silence dissent, and they use those controls, and they can turn them up and down. There was a good, and this was, several years ago now, a good report in Harvard Business Review talking about how the Chinese Communist Party, uses social media to control dissent. And it's not that they don't allow dissent. What they don't allow is organized dissent. So as soon as they start to see, the beginnings of an organization that might lead to a protest, then they start to censor, then they start to delete things, then they start to, and then they have the People's Armed Police, which is even more heavily funded than the People's Liberation Army, and these are the military that goes after the population. So combining digital and very well resourced People's Armed Police, they can slowly start to squelch dissent before it ever becomes anything resembling, an organization that's devoted to going against whatever the government wants. So as you've noticed, these things are petering out pretty quick in China because the Chinese Communist Party are dispersing them. Then what happens? They have the data on you. They're not going to necessarily arrest you during the protest. They'll wait for you to go home. Then they get you at home when you're by yourself, and then they take you in. They start to, pull the instigators out. They find out who was the one sending messages or who was organizing. Okay, they pull those out really rapidly. That's what's happening now. These people are going and they'll go spend time in prison. And so this is the system that they built in China. It's really, really effective. It happens so fast. I saw when I was a defense attaché, one of the guys that worked for me left his iPad in a mobike, which is one of those bikes that you can scan with a QR code, unlock, ride it somewhere, stop, lock it up. Well, he left his iPad. He came back to the embassy. The embassy called the local police bureau, and they called the guy that had the iPad on the phone just like that, and said, "Bring back the iPad." That's how much visibility the Chinese Communist Party has into individuals, in China.
Yeah, that's it's funny how people could see the good and the bad of this, right? It's always interesting how we can see some advantages of having access to such technologies to fix some of the problems we're facing, but then we're also reminded that the principle of the nation are so more important, particularly all the freedom of speech and Fourth Amendment and so on. So it's just always interesting to compare the cultures, but. So
That's what
effectively,
Trudeau
right?
said. He wanted to be like China. Remember, Trudeau said, "Hey, I wish I had a system like China," and like
Oh yeah,
that's terrible.
yeah. He's a scary one. In fact, he's done a pretty good job at doing what he said he would try to do, which is look more and more like the CCP. So so with all this, right? It sounds pretty bad. I've yet to see most of us wake up, right? I see people on the chat here, obviously also saying hey reverting the moderation in some of these obviously talking about Twitter, I guess, is a bad thing, because now foreign state actors are going to be able to continue to push their disinformation. Of course, he's forgetting at the same time that many of these people banned were U.S. citizens and not foreign actors, but and having a better ability to track and verify people is potentially solving that problem, instead of moderating content the way we decide to moderate it based on personal preferences of political opinion. In this case, having the ability first to verify the profiles and then be able to let people to make their own decisions by blocking people, which is also an option. You can also block people, right? But you see effectively people pretty divided on the topic, right? And I've yet to see us as divided as we are now, not just in the United States, but even in Europe. People struggling with the conflict in Ukraine, struggling, of course, with energy. Many European government pushing for this climate change changes that are putting their nations at tremendous risk of being completely dependent on Russia. Apparently, that's okay. Where is the world going? Are we gonna make it?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is, in Ukraine is, how far will Putin, can we push Putin before he, begins to think about using his nuclear weapons? So I think that's something we have to be concerned about. I don't think that we're in for any type of peace resolution in Ukraine anytime soon. I think the best we could hope for is maybe a ceasefire or an armistice. But I think having a long-term solution for Ukraine that doesn't come with extreme risk with regard to the use of nuclear weapons in Europe, I think is something that we have to contend with. Um, and I think, so overall, I mean, we have to acknowledge we're in the second Cold War, or some will say that we never left the first Cold War. We just declared, the U.S. declared victory, but in reality, the enemies just changed their tactics and strategy. And I think this really applies to China. And in fact, when you listen to some of the writings and speeches of Xi Jinping, he says, "Look, we cannot forget what happened to the Soviet Union. They were not ideologically pure. They allowed the West to corrupt them, and we have to basically, if we want to ensure the preservation and the growth of communism as an ideology and as a system in the world, we're going to have to remain ideologically pure." Now that would seem crazy. You would think, like, what? How can we be talking that way? It's clear that the systems don't work, but they never gave it up. And so now what we've given them are the tools to actually corrupt our own society. So I do think that you're going to see China attack Taiwan. They're going to take Taiwan. What do we do about the fact that TSMC is the biggest, most important chip producer in the world now? Are we going to leave that intact? Are we going to try to destroy it? What are we going to do about the Taiwanese people? What are we going to do about the people of Ukraine? How are we going to manage this long-term war where Russia, China, America all have nuclear weapons? How do we not allow it to become the World War III where Armageddon happens, but is more the World War III where where it's an ideological and economic competition, like the first Cold War was. These are the questions that I think that the people in government, the leadership should be thinking about. The military should be thinking about that. It's not just about how do we fight and win wars. It's how do we preserve our republic in the face of new challenges that come with new technology and new international business relationships. These are the things that I think um, I'm really concerned about, and I think we haven't figured it all out. We certainly don't have the right frame of mind to pursue this problem yet. We're starting to recognize it, but if we're going to maintain, the character of the republic into the future for another 240 years, then we better start thinking about what's going on here, because quite frankly, you begin to look at how the adversaries have organized, and you look at the way that we're protecting ourselves or not. I think we left ourselves very, very vulnerable to coercion. It can be as easy as, "Hey, we're going to shut down your grid," because we have malware in it. Or again, it can be, "Hey, we're not going to allow antibiotics to flow to the United States because we control the precursors and the drugs that are manufactured." There's so many ways now, because we're so intertwined, that this can happen. And we think of Russia and Ukraine, and oh, we can punish Russia. China's a completely different story. So we are at war. The Chinese are at war with us. We haven't figured that out, and that leaves us at an incredible disadvantage.
Yeah, you're spot on again. And when you look at Ukraine and you see how much the United States has given in terms of financial aid and weapons, again, we're giving more than every other country combined. Is that normal? Is that always how it's going to be? The United States has to step up for the rest of Europe.
Well, that's the way it's been. I get a little bit frustrated with both national security professionals in America and the Europeans. There's this expectation that the United States is just going to continue to pay for Europe's defense. Um, to the extent that Europe, particularly countries like Germany or others that want to continue to have these relationships with China and Russia, certainly, then I think we have to question whether or not those are really the kind of partners that we need to be pouring our resources into continuously. So I do think there is a us or them issue here, which means that you're either with the Chinese Communist Party or you're with us. If you're with the Chinese Communist Party, then we shouldn't be spending our money to defend your borders. We shouldn't be spending our money to defend your sovereignty, because it's really your relationship with China is creating a problem for our joint security. So I do think in those terms, and this is what I advocated when I was at the White House. When we had delegations, I remember one came from Korea. Don't make us choose. We want to be China's economic partner, and we want to be your security partner. And I would say, okay, well then, why don't you get the Chinese military to defend Korea? You can have them defend you if you want to be an economic partner. And I think this is by having this kind of dichotomy of relationships, where you have an economic relationship and you have a security relationship, and they're not tightly linked. I think that's the biggest mistake in the post Cold War world. In Cold War, if you were a military partner of America, you were an economic partner of America. If you weren't an economic partner of America, you weren't going to be a military partner of America. One of the relationships that I think is the biggest one that we've failed to take advantage of is India. And I think the reason that we have is that we look at these two things in a separate space. We look at a military relationship, we look at an economic relationship, and I think if we looked at India more as an economic partner, then I think the ability to have a much more coherent national security relationship that was mutually beneficial would be there. But when you're investing economically in China and you're trying to have a military relationship with India, I just think it just makes horrible, horrible sense from a national strategy perspective.
It's pretty insane to look at these numbers here. Since January to October, we gave 28 pretty much billion versus 3.7 in the UK, and then down from there. that's just pretty scary, and it's obviously the taxpayer that's going to be footing the bill again. So that's always
Yeah,
scary
yeah,
to
that's
me.
that's crazy. You think of Europe, is roughly on the order of America's economy, and so America is, it's just crazy.
But why would they do it if they know we're gonna do it, right? They're not stupid. In fact, they've been taking advantages for forever.
Right,
They,
right.
they I would argue we're the stupid ones, right? They see us footing the bill. They're not gonna show up and be like, oh, I'm gonna pay. Don't worry, I'm gonna take the check this time. They
Well, I
know
mean,
better
this is
than
what I
this.
found when I was looking at think tanks, and in relation to China. So you have all these think tanks in America, and who's giving the think tanks money? A lot of these countries are giving the think tanks money. So what do you think the think tanks are going to say? We need to keep sending money to these countries. Well, we this has become a way to influence the U.S. political process, in terms of how we make our policies, because so many countries are pouring money, and China is one of the biggest ones to pour money into these think tanks. And then not only that, it comes from the corporations, particularly the corporations that benefit from the money being sent. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this is the case.
And it's funny how we've depleted our weapons arms stock, and people don't realize how bad it is if we were to get into another conflict. Many of these weapons have yet to be replaced and would take 10, 15 years to be replenished, and that's that's another piece of the puzzle that people often forget about, particularly if we were to get into a conflict with Taiwan and China. So
Well, and
anyway,
to think that the Chinese don't know that, I mean, of course they're
right?
watching that. So, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
you think about it from their standpoint, what does that do? That says, hey, we need to advance our timeline. The Americans, they have nothing.
Right. I'm shocked that it hasn't happened yet, but hopefully it won't. I don't know, but in fact, going back to China, right, and the lab, and people being banned on social media for even discussing it, which was for me the definitive proof of the power of the CCP over not only the U.S. media companies but also the Chinese the social media companies by effectively controlling free speech, even for things that we all knew was at the very least something that would be a fair question to ask. Um, but people were focused too much on the pangolin or whatever. But what did we end up learning, from COVID?
Well, I think the big thing that we learned is it's so easy for the Chinese Communist Party to manipulate the international order, just by how it acts, the information it releases, and then to get the World Health Organization and the CDC to follow suit. Lockdowns. Those were invented by China, and for so long the narrative was, oh, China, does the best with regard to COVID. Never mind the fact that we actually don't know what data is collected in China, because it's the Chinese Communist Party obfuscates that. Um, so I think what we learned was these tools that we've been talking about, these tools of technology and globalization, were used by the Chinese Communist Party to stoke fear, and then to get other democracies to adopt policies that were similar to China, albeit unevenly. So they were able to. China was able to criticize those countries. Of course, there was a huge political debate within those countries. So it becomes, and this is where the Trudeau's comments come from. It comes from the lamenting the fact that the democracies couldn't control COVID the way China could. Except we don't know how China controlled COVID, because we don't have the data. And even now, you're seeing, we are making the argument that if China had the mRNA vaccine, that they wouldn't be having zero COVID. And so, just the narrative with regard to the Chinese Communist Party, zero COVID has nothing to in China has nothing to do with COVID. It has everything to do with societal control. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't care about if old people in China die because of COVID. What they care about is controlling the population, and what they've found with COVID is this ability to get them to voluntarily give up their freedoms. And oh, by the way, what else did we learn? That Americans will voluntarily give up their freedom to the government if they think it's going to make them safe. And democracies all over the world can do that to their population. The only one that didn't that basically said this is insane. It doesn't follow any of the things that we know about health was Sweden. Sweden said, we're not going to do it. And what happened? All of the social media companies, all of the countries, even the EU started to say, oh, Sweden's bad. They're doing it the wrong way. And then you look at the data coming out of Sweden and you compare that, say, to in Italy, same thing, no change. And so what do we learn from COVID? We learn that you can use the medical system to control the population through fear.
Right. It's actually funny to look at the numbers of COVID. If you look at the Chinese reported number, they only had 345,000 cases of COVID and 5,000 deaths. So that's pretty good. That's like a day in one state in the
Anybody
U.S.
would love those numbers. Like,
Well,
imagine if you were a CEO of a company and you could report your numbers whatever you want, and there was no SEC to come in and check your work. No, just go report whatever.
yeah. Well, they have the SEC, they have the WHO, so they do whatever they want. In fact, even the aftermath, it's still surprising that no one is talking about any kind of proper due diligence around what happened. Of course, they had full control of the WHO at the time, but even now, no one is even talking about looking at some of these damages. Not to mention, they were able to sell us quite a few masks and other protective gear during COVID, and I'm sure that cleared a pretty big profit too, right? So that's always interesting how they end up profiting. Not to mention, I would argue the election in the U.S. was drastically impacted by COVID as well. So that's another way of having quite a lot of impact on the United States and the economy with trillions of debt now added to the nation. So
Absolutely.
one thing that you did a very good job, and again, for people that have not read the book, I don't honestly, I think I only recommended one book in my life, so that's the only one. So if you have to read one book in your life, that's the one. What Were the Rules, again, on generalspalding.com, and of course it's on. I actually listened to it. It was pretty fun on Audible as well. So check that out. But you did a very good job there explaining to people in a normal way, so anyone can understand what is unrestricted warfare all about. And tell us a little bit for the audience, what they're going to be able to read in the book and what it is.
Well, it just puts all of these. What unrestricted warfare is, the document is a doctrine document. And I think one of the mistaken, one of the challenges with understanding unrestricted warfare as a document is that people like to call it a strategy. It's not a strategy. And then most people aren't familiar with military doctrine because they haven't been instructed in national security and they haven't studied. But doctrine documents really are a set of principles that you use to be successful in warfare. And so, what unrestricted warfare was a new kind of doctrine document, and it said that these two things that are coming into the world, the internet and globalization, are going to unlock this ability to use the day to day as a weapon against your adversary, particularly if you're willing to in public adopt all the principles of the liberal democratic order, but in private actually violate all of those rules. And so the war without rules is just saying that if you suspend all the rules in terms of yourself with regard to interactional behavior, but yet the globalization of the internet is bringing you closer into the fabric of society with free societies, this will allow you to use the day to day to get your interests met. So that whether it be influencing the political and policymaking process in the United States, whether it be influencing the citizens through platforms like TikTok and Twitter, or whether it be influencing the corporations through allowing them to build factories and sell to your population, or investing in those corporations, or whether it be influencing the financial institutions like the banks by giving them access to your economy but not really allowing them to take advantage of it, or universities by giving them money and sending students at full rate so that their entire budget relies on it. It was basically, how do you leverage all of these relationships and the day to day to destroy the faith and confidence of a people in its system over the course of generations. And so It's been at it 4 decades now, and I think what happened, particularly, so unrestricted warfare came out in 1999. It was translated by the open source folks at CIA, and so I read it for the first time in '99. Didn't make a lot of sense, of course. '99, if you remember, I think I had a 28 baud modem, maybe had a still 9600. I can't remember where it was, and a big old CPU, and that was the state. And I remember for the first time in '99 seeing Google. I think it was either '99 or 2000 that I went to Google for the first time. Now you fast forward to 2007, the iPhone comes out, and then 2009 4G networks start coming out, and you have the mobile economy. You have the explosion of the FANGs and the ability to use all this data you're collecting on people. So they, in 1999, were able to see, and they were visionaries. They were able to see where the world was going to go and how you could leverage what the free world was doing in terms of giving access to all of these totalitarian regimes to this technology and the talent and the capital, that what you could do with that. And so unrestricted warfare is really about leveraging all aspects of society to essentially get your interests met in this case, as the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When you read the book, particularly what's interesting is if you go back to read the open source version of it, it's unreadable. I mean, it's so painful, I guess, to read. You've done a pretty good job at bringing all the ideas and making it something digestible, because I can tell you most people wouldn't want to read the original stuff. Not to mention the translation, obviously, is always painful, but in this case, it's just a painful piece of document to read without you making it something entertaining as well. So again, people should go check out the book, War with the Rules. Go check out Amazon or joelspalding.com. You'll be able to find it there, and even the Audible version. So we talked about obviously a lot of data and critical infrastructure, but we haven't touched about yet supply chain, and particularly you've seen people like Apple maybe waking up. I don't know if that's the right term, because they're pretty toxic with China anyways, but they're starting to move, I guess, their manufacturing away from China to go to India. A little too little too late, but whatever. What's your take on the supply chain?
Well, it was good. I read an article today, I think, that came out saying, the U.S. military can't go to war without China because they provide the supply chain. And, so for the first time, we're starting to recognize that what this means when China is providing the supply chain. What if you go to war with China? This is what I was asking the Defense Logistics Agency back in 2015 when I was in the Joint Staff. I'm like, okay, you're getting all this refined oil in the Pacific, but the Chinese Communist Party owns the contracts to those refineries. So, not only does the military, though, need China to go to war, things like drugs, pharmaceuticals, we are dependent on China for pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, insulin, heart medicine, blood pressure medicine, these things that people need on a day-to-day basis. China can say, hey, we're just going to cut you off, and good luck. You're not going to get these drugs. That's a tremendous. So most people think about microelectronics as the big chink in our armor, but it's really it's I think it's pharmaceuticals, number one, and then of course all the chemical precursors for just about the building blocks for just about everything. Rare earth metals, they're all processed in China. Rare earth metals aren't rare. You can find them anywhere. But what has happened here in the United States is the EPA won't allow you to have a rare earth metal processing plant. You can't have oil refineries. If you shut it down, they won't let you open a new one. So slowly, what we've been doing here in the United States is strangling our ability to both supply the population with critical needs, but also, if we get into a conflict, supply the military. So we can't even supply our population, much less our military. So what we've done, in a sense, is basically make ourselves defenseless, because it doesn't matter if you got an F-35 or a tank or a ship or a submarine. If you can't provide the fuel, if you can't provide the material that keeps that thing operating, it's absolutely meaningless. Now we know this in a logistics sense, but in a logistics sense, as long as China is willing to send us the stuff, we think that there's no problem. Well, what happens when they cut that off? And this is what the Russians' invasion of Ukraine just shows. What happens? The United States try to cut off Russia's access to the supply chain. What do you think China is going to do in a similar situation if they have some kind of issue with the United States? They just cut us off. So this is something that I think people are, I think they understand. But again, what are we doing about it? We have tools like Defense Production Act, Title III. We've used them in very limited cases. We haven't actually said, what is it going to take to ensure that this country cannot be coerced because some element of our supply chain is stuck in China?
It's pretty mind-boggling to see how bad it is getting. I would argue, like you said, obviously all medicine and metal, but they also took over all of the mining in Afghanistan. I mean, Africa, it's just all EV batteries, all the components would completely depend on China. That's why Tesla is so dependent on China. Of course, now they're using that against Elon Musk, saying, "Oh, you see, he's doing the bidding of China because he needs it to build batteries." But they forget that every other company that's trying to build batteries will also need China as well. So it's always easy how we pick and choose the information. Of course, there would be no car battery without Elon Musk too, because no one would have an EV anyway. So it's always funny how the good guy becomes a bad guy overnight. But I have one last question for you before we go to a couple of questions from the public here that I created. Obviously, we talk a lot of things that keep me up at night. What keeps you up at night?
Well, obviously, I've talked a lot about our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. That's kept me up at night ever since 2014 in the Pentagon, when I realized that the way I looked at the world was the wrong way. I think the other thing that just since I've been out, as a entrepreneur in the startup world, is just making sure that my company survives to be able to provide the capabilities that I think that America needs. I think this is a case for any entrepreneur that's passionate about what they do. I care about our employees. I care about actually fulfilling this mission, and I think that in that regard, every dollar that you send to China for a startup, every time that you're not thinking about the things that I think that make this country strong, and making sure that our technology talent and capital is going in. I think you're we're slowly losing our competitiveness. We're bleeding out, and so it's just keeping my company going is the thing that I think about 24/7. And that's the thing. If I wake up at night and I start thinking, I'm thinking about how do I keep my company going, and how do I fulfill this mission of protecting infrastructure and data.
And obviously, we have a lot of followers here listening from VCs and funds, and many care about the future of our nation. And of course, they can reach out to you. I put your Twitter and, of course, your LinkedIn as well for people to reach out for your next round. That's going to be important to make sure you're closing that and can focus back on your mission instead of thinking of the funding piece of it, which just slows everybody down. So people don't hesitate to reach out to Joel Spalding directly or to me, and I can make the introduction. Um, Last, two questions for you before we let you go. Obviously, we kind of touched about it. The Apple disabled their AirDrop, not really completely, by the way. They kind of blocked it to 10 minutes, so you can't. So they tried to make it look like it wasn't a massive change, but people were using AirDrop to share content between people, so they didn't have to use. And so they were trying to bypass the Great Firewall, I guess, by using app-to-app AirDrop. And they China asked Apple to limit it to 10 minutes. So now people would have to go back into the settings every 10 minutes to re-enable it instead of just living it on, for the full day. So what's your take on Apple doing China's bidding?
Well, I think the fact that Apple as a company, and this really also gets into ESG investing, which I think is a complete joke. Um, I think having an activist policy that is not consistent, it would be better. It would be more honest for Apple not to have any say in terms of activism, whether they're in the United States or China. So, if you remember, they took a very strong position with regard to voting in Georgia. But then they're going to help the Chinese Communist Party censor people in China. It would be better if they just wouldn't comment on social issues
Right.
within America. If they're going to, basically help a totalitarian regime against the Chinese people. Um, remember all the backlash that the government got because it wouldn't cut off relationship with the Saudis after the Khashoggi incident. Why is that not happening with regard to Apple? In the case of basically helping the Chinese Communist Party silence the Chinese people. I think this is it's what it's done is it's just clearly shown the hypocrisy of U.S. corporations. Their activism is entirely self-interested. It has nothing to do with morals, and I think that's the main failing of our of the U.S. corporations at this point in our history is that they try to pretend to be socially conscious, and of course what they're looking for is all these funds that have raised money, and I know this is one that Elon Musk has been poking fun at, and I agree with that, based on ESG things. Well, the ESG tends to mean whatever the person making the investment thinks it means, and it certainly isn't universal in terms of it's okay that you suppress or oppress these people over here, but not over here. And over here, you want to say something different than over here. It's so intellectually dishonest. I think, if I was put in that role of having to run Apple and recognizing that, hey, I've got operations in China and I've got operations in the United States. If if I couldn't convince my investors that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be operating in China, then I certainly wouldn't be preaching to the people of America while essentially doing even worse to the people of China. That's where I think that the big fault of Apple is here, because you can't answer that, you can't respond to it. You're like, what do you say to when somebody says, "Well, you did this thing over here, but you did this over here. Why?"
Yeah, they're trying to hide it. In fact, it was one of the only time that Apple did not mention such a big change in their release note of the upgrade of the next iOS version. So that tells you they were trying to hide it. It didn't work out. They got caught. And, that's what happened when you have people without a real backbone, and they say things they don't mean, and they just do whatever they actually want to do. And they just want to hold us accountable for their mistakes because they couldn't do it anyways. So it's always interesting. Last question for you before we let you go. I know we're out of time. Um, so we have a lot of international guests, right? And obviously, and you've seen it, right? You helped us make sure that the U.S. didn't get caught with Huawei here in the U.S. with 5G deployments. What's your opinion of China doing a pretty good job, not only in Latin America but also in Africa, deploying their tech stack so they end up controlling those markets?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll answer that with a question. Do you think Saudi Arabia should have control over its oil, or do you think that everybody should have access to Saudi's oil and they don't have a say? Because if you listen to Kai-Fu Lee, who is China's thought leader on artificial intelligence, he was the CEO of Google China. He's written AI Superpower. What Kai-Fu Lee says is that China seeks to become the Saudi Arabia of data. What is he saying? He's saying data is the most valuable resource of any country. The data that's collected on your citizens, that is more valuable than oil. That's what Kai-Fu Lee is saying, because it drives artificial intelligence. It also allows you to understand and do things for your citizens in ways that are either for your interests or against your interests. And I think So if you understand that the most valuable thing that's being created in your country is data, and then you're giving that data freely to others, whether it be a corporation or a government, then I think I don't even know what to say to that. It's like, here, just take all my most valuable possession. For what? What are you getting from it? And so, whether you're a citizen or whether you're a government official or whether you working for a corporation, I guess if you have no, if you have no allegiance to your country, then whatever, or even to your own self. Like, if you're a citizen of this country and you have your device and all that data is being collected about you, this is monetarily, why would you allow another nation to benefit from the wealth of your nation by collecting all of your data? I just don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. It's not like we that's why we have this idea of borders, of sovereignty, Westphalian kind of the idea of a nation state, that what's within the borders ought to be under the control of the people of those, that lives within those borders. But here you're just saying, you can have whatever. I think it's just, um, I remember the last time that I sat down with Dr. Kissinger, for about 2 hours, and he talked about his view of national security is very geographic oriented, talked about Europe, talked about the Middle East, talked about Asia. And then we started talking about data and artificial intelligence and how he thought that artificial intelligence was dangerous, and could be used against humanity. And I said, well, now you understand. When I think of national security, I think in terms of data, because data, that's how data can be misused. It can be used for, either ill or good. And if you don't think of national security today in terms of data, then you're wrong. It's not about physical borders anymore. It's about digital borders, and how, most importantly, your wealth, the wealth of your nation, is finding its way in either the other corporations or other nations.
Yeah, and of course, the government, local government officials are pretty happy because I'm sure they're making quite a lot of money from the deals, and it's also short-term savings that they argue is worth the reason to do it. But what they forget is the long-term cost that's going to come out of it, and not only that, but also their loss of complete freedom and complete dependency on China. With that, I want to thank you, Joel Spalding, for joining us. It was a great pleasure to have you. You were able to really raise awareness here regarding so many different key topics that are very near and dear to me and everybody watching the show. Before I let you say the parting words, because you're always the one here saying goodbye to everybody, I'm going to remind everybody that next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have Catherine Logan from ViVSoft. She's going to come and talk about the challenges of having a small business to do business with the government. Back to what Joel Spalding talked about today. So we're going to talk about Sabres, StratFies, and all the complexity of recruiting talent, funding, and growing a company in the universe of the federal government, and maybe dual use as well. So that's going to be a very fun episode. With that, over to you, Joel Spalding, for the last words.
Well, I just want to thank you for having me on. I think, I always thought that your decision to go into government after you had a successful business career was very noble, and I think we need more people like that. The understanding the complexity of technology today and its impact on national security, and certainly on the preservation of our republic. This is so important. We just don't have enough people that are willing to give of their time, and to bring their passion to preserving this great republic. So I want to thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on the show.
Well, thanks everybody. Everybody stay safe and keep up the good fight so our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. See you next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern. Stay safe. Bye bye.